Greetings, welcome back to Black Bear News, where we are discussing abrupt climate change. And thank you all for your continued commentary on these videos. Always really good exchanges, good stuff. Sometimes they get a little unwieldy, but generally the level of commentary on this channel is quite high, and I really do appreciate that. Just want to bring you some, news. Generally, the news on this channel is frightening. I will say definitely this is one of the few places where you are going to get a mix of things that you might not get on other channels. Probably one of the few places that you will hear conspiracy theories talked about in the same sentence as climate change, because generally those two things don't mix. It's oil and water. But hopefully that doesn't put too many of you off. I, for one, think it's quite important to talk about real things that are happening in the world and bring evidence to support those things. Generally, we are talking about climate change because it is the greatest existential threat, clearly and obviously, to all of us, humans and animals and plants included, on this earth. So we need to address this, and quickly. I'm sorry if there's some lag time in the video. Usually when I start running out of space on my computer, the memory starts going, and generally that causes my video to lag a little bit. I did a little cleanup yesterday, and I'm still working on it. So I apologize in advance if that starts happening, but that's what's happening, if you're wondering. I believe it was Dash Bots brought this to my attention. This is from Google Patents. Abstract. World peace and resolution of conflicts depends upon methods to deter use of weapons of mass destruction. Negotiations are the primary method to resolve conflicts. Pain, especially non-tissue sources of pain, is ubiquitous in the minds of humans and is an impediment to successful conflict resolution. It is proposed that leaders who are at peace with themselves are more likely to negotiate win-win resolutions of conflicts. When negotiations fail and deployment of weapons of mass destruction by a country is imminent, targeting the brain of its leaders to change their intentions may be reasonable and necessary. Concentrated, extremely low frequency electromagnetic waves can penetrate the cranium in the most conductive portion of the skull, the pterion temporal lobe intersection, and produce effects in the anterior temporal lobe that contains the amygdala, excuse me. Remote stimulation of the temporal lobe may cause lethal or incapacitating seizures. Stimulation of the amygdala produces fear in a high percentage of humans, and in some instances, respiratory depression. Using the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction as a model of brain activity, an early prototype of this weapon was developed. In order to prevent another arms race, this technology should be assigned to the United Nations. Wow. Other devices or methods to cause a change in the state of consciousness. Devices for producing or ending sleep by mechanical, optical, or acoustical means, e.g. for hypnosis, for inducing sleep or relaxation, direct nerve stimulation, hypnosis, analgesia. Yeah. So anyways, I'm going to link this below. Y'all can just look at it. There's some just interesting Religious ideologies as sources of pain, claiming and acting as if one religion is superior to all others, coerced conversion, discrimination in which laws favor a religious sect, blah, 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 blah. Detailed description of the invention targeting electromagnetic waves to the brain will require a source of electromagnetic waves, concentration of the waves, targeting of the waves, and measurement of outcome. So, here you go. This is happening. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not like, I wonder, that would be weird if. No, it's actually happening. And I read this because I'm going to read this article. If you all haven't heard about this, quite disturbing stuff. More consulate workers evacuated after mystery illness strikes Americans in China. So this was happening in Cuba as well, where American diplomats were evacuated because they were suffering symptoms of like a brain injury or concussions. And it was quite scary. The State Department evacuated at least 2 more Americans from the U.S. consulate in Guangzhou, China, on Wednesday after they began showing signs of a mysterious illness, the New York Times reported. The new cases came just weeks after the first report of a sick U.S. consulate employee in Guangzhou. Each experienced symptoms that resemble an illness that has affected dozens of Americans in Cuba since 2016. They were reported hearing strange noises and suffering from dizziness, headaches, tinnitus, fatigue, cognitive issues, visual problems, ear complaints, and hearing loss, and difficulty sleeping. The State Department said in a statement on Tuesday. Officials said the safety of American personnel and their families was their top priority. As soon as the State Department received medical confirmation that one U.S. government employee had suffered a medical incident that was consistent with what American personnel in Havana, Cuba had experienced, the State Department deployed a medical team to Guangzhou, China, to conduct a medical screening of all U.S. government employees and family members who requested it. Agency spokesperson Heather Nauert said in a statement. Nauert also said medical professionals will conduct full, I wish this ad would go away, full evaluations to determine the cause of the reported symptoms and whether the findings are consistent with those noted in previously affected government personnel or possibly completely unrelated. Last month, the State Department issued a health alert for travelers to Guangzhou, saying an employee had reported subtle and vague but abnormal sensations of sound and pressure. Despite the hazy description, the agency said it took the report seriously and warned anyone experiencing similar symptoms to consult with a doctor. One of the diplomats in China who reported symptoms described his experience to the Washington Post, saying he was in his apartment when he heard something like marbles bouncing and hitting a floor, then rolling on an incline with a static sound. The man, a Foreign Service officer at the Guangzhou Consulate, said he began experiencing headaches and sleeplessness several months later, as did his wife and 3-year-old child. Since 2016, 24 employees at the American Embassy in Cuba and their family members have reported similar episodes. The Times reported that the illnesses frayed some diplomatic relations with Cuba, but the recent reports have led others to consider if another country may be involved, including China or Russia. Cuba has repeatedly denied any responsibility. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo confirmed the similarities between the cases to the House Foreign Affairs Committee last month. The medical indications are very similar and entirely consistent with the medical indications that have taken place to Americans working in Cuba, he told lawmakers. We are working to figure out what took place both in Havana and now in China as well. The State Department has formed a task force to investigate the illnesses. Scary stuff, indeed. And you know, we don't know what kind of weaponry that we or other states possess that can do, you know, this kind of damage to people. I mean, we know that there are sonic, you know, like crowd dispersal devices and threat mitigation devices, sonic weapons. You know, it would be it's a scary thing because also I've heard from a lot of sources, and of course I'm sure many of you have heard this, the 5G, the new 5G network that's being rolled out, can be accessed in order to have, you know, create effects on people, quote unquote, control people. And that is a frightening thing to think about as well. So, you know, as we are talking and communicating and learning and getting more advanced through this technology, it is also being used to, I'm sure, affect people in extremely negative ways. So, as more more news comes out about this kind of stuff, this kind of technology, definitely I want to read some more stuff about the 5G phenomenon, because there are a lot of people who are concerned about what can be done with that technology. You know, I've heard stories that they already know and have ways of controlling people or infiltrating people's minds through your phone. You know, so, and I really, you know, I wouldn't doubt that at all. I wouldn't negate that possibility just out of hand. I would definitely be concerned about stuff like that. There was a report a few months ago about somebody killing themselves in front of the White House, and that it was a strange thing that, you know, somebody just, I don't know, kind of lost it, went in front of the White House and killed themselves. And a lot of people were reporting this as some kind of like mind control, MK Ultra, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. MK Ultra is an actual thing. It actually happened, not a conspiracy. It actually happened. Conspiracy fact. So, you know, if they have the technology to possibly control people or control people's minds or affect people in extremely negative ways, what makes you think that they wouldn't do it? And that actually, I'm going to pause this for a second because it reminds me of something else that I saw. I remember what it was, and I'm going to see if I can find the article, but one of y'all sent it to me. I believe it was Robin may have sent it to me. About, so apparently they do have technology that can see through walls, and this article is about precisely that technology that can basically somehow get a, you know, like a sonar image map, you know, they can basically see people moving through walls. And this whole article was about, you know, how, oh, this is going to be great for medical purposes, or, you know, it was just really like the reason for developing this technology was just so bizarre and kind of flimsy, you know, like, oh, we're going to track, you know, the elderly and be able to see how they're moving and be able to detect, you know, medical problems that could arise. And I was like, bullshit, this is a weapon. Like the whole art, you know, they went through this article explaining how it worked and like, oh, how it's going to help people. And the whole time I was reading it, I was thinking like, so you're just going to avoid the whole idea that this can be weaponized and be used to basically watch people through walls, to target people, you know, through walls, and do whatever it is that you want to do to them. Anyways, scary stuff. I'm moving on to some climate change news. This is from The Guardian, June 13th. Rise in global carbon emissions, a big step backwards, says BP. Coal rebound and slowing efficiency gains in 2017 suggest Paris goals may be missed, says oil firm. The renewed upward march of global carbon emissions is worrying and a big step backwards in the fight against climate change, according to BP. Emissions rose 1.6% in 2017 after flatlining for the previous 3 years, which the British oil firm said was a reminder the world was not on track to hit the goals of the Paris climate deal. Because we do need to be reminded that we're not going to hit those goals, and we're just not going to hit those goals. Renewable power generation grew by 17% last year, which is great, led by wind and followed by what BP called stunning, quote unquote, growth in solar. But strong economic growth led to above average energy demand. Coal use bounced back in China and the efficiency gains slowed down, causing emissions to jump. The company's annual statistical review of the world energy found Spencer Dale, the group's chief economist, said, at first blush, from an energy transition perspective, these numbers potentially look a bit disappointing. The emissions rise was slightly worrying and a pretty big backward step back. He said, it suggests to me we are not on a path to the Paris climate goals. However, the economist said there was an inevitability of the backsliding because 2014 to 16 had seen an exceptionally fast shift to greener power sources led by short-term targets in China. I am more worried by the lack of progress in the power sector over the past 20 years than by the pickup in carbon emissions last year. Dale said the power sector, in which BP has a limited presence, should do most of the heavy lifting when it comes to future emission cuts. It's frustrating that so much energy is devoted to other bits of the energy sector where you get relatively little bang for your buck, he said, in reference to emission savings from switching from oil-burning cars to electric ones. BP says the world's appetite for oil remained strong as it grew 1.8% last year. Production cuts by OPEC and Russia had achieved their aim of bringing oil supply and demand back into balance, Dale said. But he cautioned that oil prices, which recently hit $80 per barrel, but have since fallen back to about 76, were now so high they were beginning to curb oil demand. If we saw oil prices maintain at these levels, that would eat into oil demand, he said. BP reported profits up 71% for the first 3 months of the year, off the back of the resurgent oil price. And I'm sure they're not unhappy about that in any way, shape, or form. 71% rise in profits. Thanks. To the next article, climate change could lead to major crop failures in world's biggest corn regions. 2 new studies looking at corn and vegetables warn of a rising risk of food shocks and malnutrition with unchecked global warming. Climate change will increase the risk of simultaneous crop failures across the world's biggest corn growing regions and lead to less of the nutritionally critical vegetables that health experts say people aren't getting enough of already, scientists warn. 2 new studies published Monday in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences look at different aspects of the global food supply but arrive at similarly worrisome conclusions that reiterate the prospects of food shocks and malnutrition with unchecked global warming. While developing tropical countries would likely be hardest hit, the destabilizing financial effects could reach all corners of the globe, the authors say. One paper analyzed corn or maize, the world's most produced and traded crop, to project how climate change will affect it across the major producing regions. Much of the world's corn goes into feeding livestock and making biofuels. And swings in production can ripple through global markets, leading to price spikes and food shortages, particularly for the 800 million people living in extreme poverty. The researchers found significant differences in corn yield depending on how high global temperatures rise. An increase of 4 degrees Celsius wipeout, close to where the current greenhouse gas emissions trajectory would take us by the end of the century, could cut U.S. corn production by nearly half. Really? Only half? If global warming is instead held to 2°C, the goal of the Paris Climate Agreement is to stay below that level. The projected loss in U.S. production would be closer to 18%, the researchers found. I find these numbers very, very bizarre. While those numbers are pretty dramatic, the researchers find that the chances of top producing regions suffering extreme yield losses at the same time rises too. When the researchers looked at the 4 biggest corn exporters, the US, Brazil, Argentina, and Ukraine, they found that the likelihood of all 4 suffering yield losses of 10% or more at the same time rises from about 7% at 2C warming to 86% at 4C warming. Such simultaneous shocks in the top producing regions, which are rare now, could have significant impacts on global markets and drive up the price of food. Are they rare? Or I guess simultaneous shocks. Global grain prices have been going up because of the demands and biofuels, said Michelle Tigchelar, the lead author of the study and a researcher with the University of Washington. That has made markets tighter. So when you have a yield shock, that has really big implications for the market and for global stability. During the last global food crisis in 2007 and 2008, rising costs triggered riots and unrest in countries around the world. Vegetables also at risk from global warming. The second study published Monday looked at how environmental changes brought on by climate change could impact the production and quality of vegetables and legumes. Foods that government nutrition guidelines and nutritionists urge people to eat more of. Researchers led by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, looked at 174 studies across 40 countries, published since 1975. The authors say it is the first attempt to systematically examine how climate-induced environmental changes could impact yields of vegetables and legumes around the world. While previous research has shown that increased levels of carbon dioxide could boost some vegetables and legume yields, the new study finds that any benefits will be offset by the negative effects of increased ozone, less water availability, and increased salinity. Nutritionally important vegetables and legumes can be particularly sensitive to temperature increases and more vulnerable to heat stress than staple or cereal crops. The researchers found that without efforts to reduce emissions, a lack of water and increased ozone would cut yields of vegetables by about 35% in the second half of this century. Result: people lose key sources of nutrition. Globally, about 2 billion people are having a little bit of difficulty here trying to get this to stay. Globally, about 2 billion people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies linked to lack of vegetables and legume consumption, while worldwide per capita consumption of vegetables and fruits is between 20 and 50% below recommended levels. Vegetables and legumes are vital components of a healthy, balanced, and sustainable diet, and nutritional guidelines consistently advise people to incorporate more vegetables and legumes into their diet, said Pauline Schielbeek, the lead author of the study. Our new analysis suggests, however, that this advice conflicts with the potential impacts of environmental changes that will decrease the availability of these important crops unless action is taken. Another recent study that analyzed the impacts of climate change on rice, a primary food source for 2 billion people, found that rising carbon dioxide levels will also diminish its nutrient levels. All right. Again, with the long timelines made to keep everybody feeling like, all right, maybe we should do something. As some people predict that we may see 4C in this decade. Not just the temperature itself, but the rapidity in the rise will definitely, definitely have, dare I say, an adverse, if not tragic and Armageddon-like consequence on the world's food supply. And I really hope that that's not true. I really don't want that to be true. But that is a very possible likelihood. I think I'm going to read one more, if I can get to this. Everything's moving very slow. All right, it finally loaded. This is from James Hansen, and it's pretty short and to the point, succinct. This is titled "Get Out of Jail Free Card: Carbon Capture." This is from a website called Climate Science Awareness and Solutions. Dig it. And if only this would cooperate. I am minimizing communications so that I can really, exclamation point, finish Sophie's Planet, while also providing expert testimony for several lawsuits aimed at using the judicial branch of government to force the other branches of government to do their job. However, there is enough popular misinterpretation of recent news about the cost of carbon capture that I should comment on that. David Keith has done some of the most credible work on direct air capture of CO2, so his recent paper in Joule, reporting on the cost of carbon capture, deserves attention. Media reports emphasize that these reported costs were lower than costs estimated in a report by the American Physical Society in 2011. This caused some people to believe that we may be on the way to a get-out-of-jail-free card, the hope of many that technology will come to the rescue, so we do not need to be so concerned about the mess we are leaving for young people. Unfortunately, the new news on carbon capture costs provides no support for the notion that we can solve the climate problem without fossil fuel phase-out. On the contrary, the Keith et al. Study reinforces our concerns. Many people failed to notice the matter of units. Keith reports a cost of $113 to $232 per ton of CO2 for plant designs in which the resulting CO2 is ready for sequestration. The cost per ton of carbon is higher by the factor of 44 to 12. So the reported cost is $414 to $850 per ton of CO2. Furthermore, none of the four cases include the cost of carbon storage. According to the 2015 National Academy of Science reports on CO2 removal, the costs of geological sequestration are $37 to $73 per ton. So the total cost for capture plus storage would be $451 to $923 per ton. Note that we use the cost range, 113 to 232, from the Keith paper. They also give a cost range of $94 to $232, which is what the media picked up on. However, the $94 case has the CO2 being used to make liquid fuel that, when burned, puts the CO2 back into the air. So there is no negative emission. In fact, the total process would have positive emissions, at least to some degree, right? Because you have to build all that stuff too. In Young People's Burden, we were aware that the cost estimates from the APS study were high. Based on the many studies referenced in our paper, we chose $150 to $350 per ton as an optimistic estimate of the potential future costs. The low end of the cost range, $451 to $923, based on Keith et al., is about 30% higher than the upper end of our range. In Young People's Burden, we show that even our very optimistic cost of carbon capture results in an unbearable debt for young people if high emissions continue unabated. The new estimate only reaffirmed that conclusion. The new estimates only reaffirm that conclusion. There is no prospect for a get-out-of-jail-free card. One of the legal cases now underway is an effort to block the Trump government from opening up a new area of coal mining in Montana. The total coal resources in the basin in question are twice the quantity produced in the entire U.S. since 1949. Burning even a fraction of these resources would leave an astronomical cost for young people, as I show in the linked declaration I submitted to support the case against expanding that mining. It makes no sense to exploit these resources, serving only to enrich a handful of people. Most of the coal would be shipped to the Far East, but in the end, I do not believe that the United States can escape either the moral or legal obligations from such a willful disregard of the consequences for young people. It makes no sense to approve such expansion of coal mining, and I believe that chances of blocking that expansion are good. So there you go, James Hansen weighing in on the carbon capture technological hopium of such devices. I don't think many here really thought that that was much of an answer. And it's all part of, more technology, more technology, more technology, the technological drive to just keep going forward and making more and having more people and eating more food and et cetera, et cetera. All of these have consequences which are quickly catching up to us. Best way to stop these consequences is to stop doing those things. Stop the building, stop the I don't know if you can call it stop progress, but just stop, stop seeing technology as, something that just must go forward. We should be questioning every single thing that we put into our world, on an order of magnitude, hundreds of times more than what we do. What we do now is go like, that sounds like a good idea. Let's do it. And in extreme cases of caution, we have, environmental studies and environmental impact studies. And, we have some people that kind of look at like, oh, we're going to kind of look at this before we okay it, before we rubber stamp it. But those studies should be much more involved, much more strenuous, much more detailed, take much longer time. Every single thing that we put into our world on a technological level should be slowed way, way down, because we see what the results are from just, going forward. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. If you would like to support this channel, you can do so at the links below. Until next time, peace.